Welcome to Spoken Romance Library. This is part 3 of our slow burn love series. Missed the earlier parts? Links are in the description. Enjoy the series.
Chapter 7. James stared at his screen in disbelief. The calendar invite for Victoria's meeting with the Hansen group showed 2 p.m. He distinctly remembered scheduling it for 11 a.m. "That's not possible," he muttered, clicking through to the email thread. There it was, Victoria's original instruction. "Schedule Hansen for 11, not 2. I have the board strategy session at 2. The email was timestamped Tuesday, 1:43 p.m. He recalled receiving it while at lunch with Chad. He'd read the email, made a mental note, and then nothing. He'd forgotten to actually update the calendar. James's stomach dropped. The Hansen Group was flying in specifically for this meeting, their CEO, CFO, an entire innovation team. Victoria had been pursuing them for months, and now, at 10:17 a.m., they were presumably already en route to the Sharp Innovations offices, expecting to meet Victoria in 43 minutes. Victoria, who was currently across town at a breakfast presentation that wouldn't end until at least 11:30. James reached for his phone with unsteady hands. As Victoria's executive assistant, he had made exactly 3 scheduling errors in 3 years. Each had been minor and easily fixable. This was neither minor nor fixable. The Hansen Group was too important, the executive's time too valuable, and Victoria's reputation for precision too essential to her authority. What made the mistake even more frustrating was that he'd been distracted at lunch, his thoughts drifting to Victoria even during the brief breakout. The way she looked in the car after the Petrov dinner, her guard momentarily lowered, had occupied his thoughts for days. He knew better than to analyze her every word, knew better than to search for meaning in her rare moments of warmth, but he couldn't help himself. The simple truth that he'd been trying to deny since his first year with her was that his feelings ran far deeper than professional respect or admiration. He called Victoria's private line. It went straight to voicemail, which meant she had her phone off during the presentation, standard Victoria protocol. He sent an urgent text, knowing she occasionally checked texts even during events. "Emergency. Hansen meeting scheduled incorrectly for 11 a.m. today, not 2 p.m. Please call ASAP." Next, he called Marcus. "I need you to stall the Hansen Group when they arrive. Tell them Victoria's previous meeting is running long. Offer the full coffee and pastry service, the works. I'm trying to reach her now." "Jesus, James. The Hansen people? Victoria will—" "I know what Victoria will do. Just buy me some time." He tried her number again. Voicemail. He debated his options. He could call the event coordinator at the breakfast presentation and ask them to get Victoria an urgent message, but interrupting her during a keynote would only add public embarrassment to her anger. His phone rang. Victoria's private line. "James." Her voice was clipped, precise. "Explain." He could tell she had stepped out of the presentation to take my call. The muffled sound of applause in the background confirmed it. "I made a scheduling error. The Hansen Group is arriving at 11 a.m., not 2 p.m. I have Marcus ready to stall them, but you won't be back in time." He kept his explanation concise, knowing Victoria hated rambling excuses. The silence that followed was worse than any immediate explosion of anger. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice was deadly calm. "Where is the presentation deck?" "On the shared drive. And on your tablet, the latest version fully updated with the revisions you requested yesterday." "And you're certain they're coming at 11? "Yes, I found your email with the clear instruction. I simply—" He hesitated. "I failed to update the calendar after receiving it." Another pause. James could almost see her calculating options, evaluating the least damaging course of action. "Have Marcus take them to the executive conference room, not the main boardroom. I'll connect remotely at 11:15. It was a salvage plan. Not ideal, but workable. Victoria would present virtually until she could get back to the office. "I'll handle it." "Yes, you will." The edge in her voice could cut glass. "And James? We'll discuss this failure afterward." The line went dead. James moved quickly, setting everything in motion. He messaged Crawford, briefed Marcus, and prepared the conference room. He set up Victoria's tablet, testing the video connection twice to ensure flawless functionality. At 10:58, the reception desk called to announce the Hansen Group's arrival. The Hansen executives arrived all polished smiles and firm handshakes. James escorted them to the conference room, smoothly explaining that Victoria was finishing an urgent client call and would join them momentarily. Crawford arrived with the legal documents, buying precious minutes with procedural requirements. At precisely 11:15, the large screen on the wall flickered to life, revealing Victoria's face. She was in what appeared to be a private office at the presentation venue, her expression composed and confident. "Mr. Hansen, Mrs. Reeves, gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I appreciate you making time for this discussion today." James stood at the back of the room, tablet in hand, ready to advance her presentation slides remotely as needed. Victoria caught his eye briefly through the camera, her gaze arctic. For the next 20 minutes, Victoria conducted the meeting flawlessly from her remote location. If the Hansen executives were bothered by the arrangement, they showed no sign of it. Victoria was, as always, compelling and authoritative, deftly handling questions and objections with the precision of a surgeon. At 11:37, the conference room door opened silently, and Victoria herself walked in, impeccably dressed, not a hair out of place despite what must have been a frantic journey across town. James blinked in surprise. She'd made it back far sooner than expected. Without missing a beat, Victoria seamlessly transitioned from the screen to in-person presence, apologizing once for the unusual start to our meeting before guiding the conversation into deeper strategic waters. The screen behind her went dark as James disconnected the remote feed. The remainder of the meeting proceeded perfectly. By 12:45, the Hansen Group was committed to moving forward with the partnership. As James escorted them out, Tim Hansen himself commented, "Sharp by name, sharp by nature. Your CEO doesn't miss a detail, does she?" James managed a professional smile. Precision is something of a religion around here. When he returned to the conference room, Victoria was still seated at the head of the table, reviewing notes on her tablet. The room was empty otherwise. "Close the door," she said without looking up. James did as instructed, then stood waiting for the explosion. Victoria continued reviewing her notes for another full minute, a power move designed to amplify his discomfort. Finally, she set the tablet down and looked up. "Explain to me how this happened." "I received your email while at lunch yesterday afternoon. I read it, but failed to immediately update the calendar. By the time I returned to work, I'd forgotten about it entirely." No excuses, no deflection. Victoria despised both. "You were at lunch?" "Yes." "With?" The question caught him off guard. "Mr. Winters." Victoria's expression didn't change. "And the lunch was so consuming that you couldn't take 30 seconds to update my calendar?" "No. It was my error, plain and simple." "Not simple, James. The Hansen Group represents a potential 8-figure contract. Their CEO and CFO just wasted time waiting for me because you couldn't manage to perform the most basic function of your job." Her voice remained eerily calm. "Do you know what I had to do to get back here by 11:37? James shook his head. "I left during a standing ovation, cut through the kitchen to avoid the event coordinator, took service elevators to the parking garage, and had Marcus arrange a police escort, citing a medical emergency." She leaned forward slightly. I lied, James. I manipulated public servants. I left 300 industry leaders wondering why I disappeared during my closing remarks, all because you were distracted by drinks with friends. Each word landed like a precise blow. This wasn't Victoria's typical demanding behavior. This was genuine anger at a genuine failure. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. Sorry doesn't undo the damage to my reputation with that audience. Sorry doesn't give me back the 45 minutes I spent creating contingency plans instead of focusing on my presentation. She stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. I selected you from 64 applicants because you demonstrated an exceptional ability to anticipate and manage complex logistics. That ability seems to have deserted you recently. The implied connection to his lunch with Winters yesterday was not subtle. James felt a flush of indignation mixed with something more complicated. Despite knowing better, part of him had hoped she'd been jealous of his meeting with Winters. Victoria's words in the car had confused him. Mine to lose. And he knew he shouldn't take them to heart, shouldn't read anything personal into her possessiveness. Yet, he couldn't help the way his heart had pounded when she'd said it, the jittery feeling that had lingered afterward. This has nothing to do with Chad Winters. It was a simple oversight that, unfortunately, had significant consequences. He tried to keep the emotion from his voice, to remain as coolly professional as she always was, even as he recognized the pattern of his own self-torture, reading meaning into her words, hoping for something he knew would never materialize. Nothing in this office is simple, especially not mistakes. Victoria gathered her materials. The Hansen contract is salvaged, no thanks to you. I expect a complete audit of all upcoming scheduled commitments by end of day, with triple verification on any involving travel or external executives. Of course. She moved toward the door, then paused. You missed the quarterly performance reviews while handling the Petrov aftermath. We should schedule that. Next Thursday, 7 p.m. The statement was loaded with subtext. Quarterly reviews typically happen during business hours. Scheduling his for 7 p.m. suggested it would be particularly unpleasant, a deliberate incursion into his personal time as punishment. I'll add it to the calendar. Immediately. He couldn't quite keep the edge from his voice. Victoria turned, catching the tone. Problem? No. Good. Because while I value your contributions, James, I need absolute reliability. If you can't provide that because you're distracted by social engagements or recruitment meetings with my competitors, perhaps this isn't the right environment for you after all. The threat was clear and entirely unlike Victoria. She demanded perfection, but had never before suggested his job was in jeopardy. It was an escalation that felt disproportionate to even this significant error. Are you firing me over one scheduling mistake? Victoria's eyes narrowed. I'm reminding you that your position here requires absolute focus and commitment. I can't afford errors caused by divided attention or divided loyalties. My loyalty has never been in question, James replied, his own anger finally surfacing, intensified by the feelings he'd been fighting to control for years. I declined Winter's offer, as I'm sure you already know since you have Marcus tracking my movements. A flicker of something, surprise, crossed Victoria's face before she controlled it. Your meetings are your business as long as they don't interfere with your duties here. That's not what you said in the car after the Petrov dinner. You made it very clear you consider me yours to lose. He met her gaze directly, his heart pounding traitorously in his chest. Victoria's mixed signals were the worst form of torment. He knew he shouldn't let them affect him, knew he was just prolonging his own suffering by reading into them, but he couldn't stop himself. "You can't have it both ways, Victoria. Either I'm just an employee who made a mistake, or I'm something more to you, in which case this overreaction suggests something beyond professional disappointment." The words hung between them, charged with implications. James felt the familiar conflict rise within him, the rational part of his brain telling him to stop this self-destructive attachment, while the rest of him held on to the smallest signals that might indicate Victoria saw him as more than just an efficient assistant. The room went silent. Victoria's expression was unreadable, but James could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slightly too controlled breathing. He'd crossed a line, bringing their unspoken dynamic into explicit discussion. After what felt like an eternity, Victoria spoke, her voice unusually quiet. "You're right. I can't have it both ways." Something vulnerable flickered across her face, so quickly he might have imagined it. "Complete the calendar audit. We'll discuss everything else at your performance review." She turned toward the door again, paused for a fraction of a second as if she might say something more, then left without another word. The soft click of the door closing behind her was somehow more devastating than a slam would have been. James remained standing in the empty conference room, the aftermath of his mistake expanding far beyond a simple scheduling error. For the first time in 3 years, he questioned whether Victoria's impossible standards were worth meeting. More troubling was the realization that, despite everything, her cutting remarks, her impossibly high expectations, her hot and cold behavior, he still cared deeply what she thought of him. He sank into a chair, confronting once again the truth he'd known for years, but could never seem to escape. He was in love with Victoria Sharp. Against all logic, against his better judgment, despite exactly knowing how this would end. Every day was a fresh exercise in self-torture, watching for signs that she might feel something beyond professional appreciation, analyzing her words for hidden meanings, letting his heart race at the briefest moments of connection. And that, far more than any scheduling error, was his real mistake. Yet knowing the futility of his feelings didn't make them any easier to dismiss. After 3 years, they should have faded. Instead, they had only grown stronger, more entrenched, more impossible to ignore, especially in moments like this, when the professional veneer between them cracked to reveal something raw and undefined.
Chapter 8. "That went better than expected," James commented as they exited the gleaming skyscraper of Fentech Technologies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling downtown streets, and he loosened his tie slightly, relieved the high-stakes meeting was behind them. Victoria walked briskly beside him, her Louboutins clicking rhythmically against the pavement. "Better than expected? They signed for 20% above our projected figure." A rare smile briefly lit her features. "It went perfectly." James nodded, tapping notes into his tablet. "I've already sent the contracts to legal. They'll expedite the processing, and we should have final approval by—" "Let's do something crazy," Victoria interrupted, stopping abruptly. James nearly collided with her, caught off guard by both her sudden halt and the suggestion. Victoria Sharp didn't do crazy. She acknowledged successes with curt nods before immediately pivoting to the next challenge. "I'm sorry?" he asked, certain he'd misheard. "You heard me." She glanced at her watch. "It's only 4. The day's practically over anyway." James blinked. "You have a 5 o'clock call with Tokyo, and there's the briefing packet for tomorrow's board meeting." Reschedule Tokyo for tomorrow morning. The board materials can wait. She was already typing rapidly on her phone. Tell Davidson to drive us to Pinewood. The old amusement park? James's brow furrowed in confusion. It's been closed for years. Victoria arched an eyebrow. Your powers of observation continue to astound me. But why would you want to go there? He pressed, ignoring the jab. A mischievous smile played at her lips, an expression so foreign on her face that James momentarily stared. Because it's forbidden. Because no one would expect Victoria Sharp to trespass in an abandoned amusement park. She resumed walking toward the waiting company car. Because I'm bored, and for once I want to do something that's not scheduled in my calendar. He followed, his mind racing through possible explanations. In 3 years, Victoria had never suggested anything remotely resembling a spontaneous outing, let alone something illicit. Even her social engagements were strategically planned to maximize networking opportunities. An abandoned amusement park hardly aligned with her meticulously crafted image. Victoria, he began as they reached the sleek black sedan, the property has been derelict for at least 5 years. It's probably not safe.
Oh, for God's sake, she said, sliding into the back seat. It's not like I'm suggesting we ride the decrepit roller coasters. I want to break the rules for once. Is that really so difficult to comprehend? James slipped in beside her, maintaining a professional distance. I just don't understand why today of all days you'd want to visit an abandoned theme park. Victoria flashed a rare, genuine smile. Because we just closed a deal everyone said was impossible, and I'm feeling invincible. She shrugged. Don't overthink it, James. I rarely indulge impulses, but when I do, I expect my staff to keep up. James discreetly checked his calendar app. The date held no significance that he could recall. No company anniversary, no milestone marker. It truly seemed to be nothing more than a whim from a woman who never had whims. Davidson, Victoria addressed the driver, take us to Pinewood Amusement Park. Ma'am, I believe that's closed, the driver replied, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. I'm aware. Take us there anyway. The drive was silent, Victoria looking almost pleased with herself, while James fielded urgent emails about their change of plans. In his peripheral vision, he noticed her fingers occasionally drumming against the leather seat, an eager gesture he'd rarely witnessed from his typically controlled boss. 40 minutes later, they arrived at the rusted entrance gates of what had once been the city's premier entertainment destination. Faded signs promising thrills, magic, adventure hung crookedly above the chained entrance. Wait in the car, Victoria instructed Davidson as she stepped out, her designer outfit incongruous against the decaying backdrop. James followed, eyeing the no trespassing signs with concern. Victoria, we really shouldn't be here. This is private property and the structural integrity of these buildings. Then wait in the car, she said dismissively, already walking toward a gap in the fence line. James sighed, knowing he couldn't let her wander alone through an abandoned property. At least let me go first, he said, catching up to her. For once, Victoria didn't argue. She stepped aside, allowing him to navigate the fence opening before following him onto the grounds. The park was eerily beautiful in its decay. Nature had begun reclaiming the once manicured pathways, with wildflowers pushing through cracked concrete and vines climbing the silent rides. The afternoon light cast the abandoned structures in gold, lending a strange dignity to their deterioration. Victoria moved with surprising enthusiasm, her eyes taking in the ruins around them with almost childlike curiosity. "Have you been here before?" James asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "Never. Well, not particularly this park," she replied, snapping a photo with her phone.
My parents were too practical for places like this. Middle-class sensibilities. Movie theaters were our big splurge. The casual mention of her family surprised him. Victoria rarely shared personal details. Your parents, they're well? He asked tentatively, realizing how little he knew about her life outside the office despite 3 years of working closely together. Victoria gave him a sidelong glance. Retired in Arizona. Dad plays golf, mom's in a book club. They call every Sunday at exactly 7 p.m. to ask when I'm bringing home a man. She rolled her eyes. Perfectly ordinary parents who somehow produced me. James tried to imagine Victoria having weekly calls with concerned parents. The image seemed at odds with the ruthless businesswoman who made board members tremble. They must be proud of what you've accomplished, he ventured. They'd be prouder of grandchildren, she replied dryly. But yes, they display my Forbes cover in their living room right next to our family portraits. They rounded a corner, coming upon a faded carousel, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop. Victoria walked past it without a second glance, her attention already drawn to a building with a faded sign reading Hall of Mirrors. James followed, noting dark clouds gathering overhead. It's going to rain soon. We should head back. It's just a bit further, she insisted, reaching the entrance to the mirrored attraction. The door hung partially open, creaking softly in the rising wind. This really isn't safe, James protested as she disappeared inside. The structural integrity is fine, her voice echoed from within. Stop being so cautious all the time, James. It's why you're still just an assistant despite your impressive credentials. You never take risks. The words stung, but he followed her into the darkened building anyway. Inside, tarnished mirrors lined narrow corridors, their reflective surfaces dulled by years of neglect. What little daylight filtered through the dirty windows cast strange, elongated shadows across the floor. I used to hate this attraction, Victoria said, her voice bouncing off the walls. All those distorted reflections, I never knew which version of myself was real. I caught glimpses of her moving ahead, her figure multiplied and warped by the mirrors. Victoria, we really should go. The weather's turning, and this place isn't structurally sound. A crack of thunder emphasized his point, followed by the sudden patter of rain on the roof.
Always the voice of caution, she called back, her tone mocking. Don't you ever get tired of playing it safe? He rounded a corner and finally caught up to her in a circular room where dozens of mirrors created an infinite regression of their reflections. Victoria stood in the center, surrounded by countless versions of herself stretching into the distance. Which one do you think is real? She asked, gesturing to her reflections. The CEO? The blessed daughter? The bitch everyone whispers about when they think I can't hear? Before James could respond, a loud crack sounded overhead. They both looked up as a section of the ceiling gave way, sending debris crashing down onto the path they'd just traversed. Victoria stumbled backward in surprise, colliding with James. He steadied her, instinctively pulling her away from the falling debris. We need to get out of here, he said urgently, scanning for an exit. This way. Victoria pointed to a maintenance door at the far end of the circular room. They rushed toward it, dust and small debris continuing to fall as the aging structure protested against the sudden storm. James reached the door first, yanking the handle. It opened to reveal a small storage room, barely larger than a closet. In here, he directed, ushering Victoria inside. The moment they both squeezed in, the door swung shut with an ominous click. James immediately tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. It's locked, he said, a sinking feeling in his stomach. What do you mean locked? Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with emerging panic. How can it be locked from the outside? Old spring mechanism, he explained, examining the door in the dim light filtering through a tiny hole. It's designed to close automatically, security measure, to prevent people from sneaking in through the maintenance areas. Victoria pressed herself against the opposite wall, which wasn't far given the confined space. So break it down. It's a security door, Victoria. Solid metal. He pulled out his phone. No signal. The storm and these concrete walls.
Another crash from outside the storage room made them both jump. The building was becoming increasingly unstable. "So we're trapped," Victoria said flatly. "Until the storm passes and we can call for help. Yes," he confirmed, trying to create as much space between them as possible in the tiny room. It was a futile effort. The closet was barely 5 feet square, with shelving taking up one wall. Their bodies were uncomfortably sandwiched, a situation made worse by the rising temperature in the unventilated space. "Wonderful," she hissed. "Trapped in a closet in an abandoned amusement park. This is exactly how I plan to spend my evening." "You're the one who insisted on coming here," James reminded her, his patience wearing thin. "Despite my warnings about safety concerns?" Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize exploring an amusement park would end with us locked in a glorified box. An abandoned, structurally unsound amusement park, which I specifically advised against entering." They glared at each other in the dim light, both breathing heavily from the adrenaline and the confined space. Victoria was so close that James could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that he'd caught hints of in elevators and meeting rooms, but never this directly. "Don't you dare say I told you so," she warned, her voice low. "I wasn't going to," he replied, though the thought had certainly crossed his mind. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the rain and occasional rumbles of thunder. Every tiny movement one of them made forced their bodies to press together in a new, awkward configuration. "Don't breathe so heavily," she snapped. "You're taking up too much space." "I'm breathing normally, and if anyone's taking up space with unnecessary movement, it's you." "Are you implying I'm implying that this closet was built for one person with a toolbox, not 2 adults." He shifted slightly, trying to ease the cramp developing in his shoulder. "And if you'd stop squirming, we might both be marginally more comfortable." "I am not squirming," she hissed, though she immediately stilled. "This is a disaster. I have the Tokyo call to reschedule the board meeting tomorrow, and I'm trapped in a utility closet with my assistant who can't even manage to make himself smaller." "My height is not the problem here," James responded, his patience finally snapping. "Your impulsiveness is. 3 years I've worked for you, Victoria. 3 years I've put up with you because you're brilliant at what you do. But this," he gestured as much as the confined space would allow, "this is ridiculous even for you." Victoria went rigid against him. In their forced proximity, she could feel the rapid rise and fall of his chest, the warmth radiating from his body.
"No one's ever spoken to me like that," she said, her voice oddly quiet. "Maybe someone should have, a long time ago." The tiny room seemed to shrink further as tension thickened the air between them. Victoria was close enough that James could count her long eyelashes as they cast a shadow across her cheeks, details invisible at their usual professional distance. "If you're so miserable working for me, why do you stay?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're overqualified, despite your height," she added with a hint of her usual bite. "I'm demanding, difficult. You could accept Winter's offer." The question caught him off guard with its honesty. Before he could formulate a response, the building around them groaned ominously and dust filtered down from the ceiling. Victoria instinctively pressed closer to him, her hand gripping his arm. "We need to get out of here," she said, urgency replacing vulnerability. James nodded, turning his attention back to the door. "If we can remove these hinges, we might be able to push it out from this side." As they awkwardly maneuvered in the tiny space to examine the door, James wondered what Victoria's momentary candor might have revealed had they not been interrupted, and what his answer might have been to her question. Why did he stay? The truth, he realized as they focused on the door hinges, was both simpler and more complicated than either of them was ready to acknowledge.
Chapter 9. The storm raged outside the maintenance room, its fury punctuated by occasional crashes as debris hit the building. Inside the cramped space, James and Victoria had passed the 30 minutes in tense silence, each leaning against opposite walls. Though in such a confined area, opposite meant barely 2 feet apart. "How long do these spring storms usually last?" Victoria finally asked, breaking the silence. She had abandoned her blazer, wrapping it over her waist. Her silk blouse clung slightly to her skin in the humid confines of the room. "Hard to say," James replied, loosening his tie further. "Could be minutes, could be hours." Victoria checked her watch for the dozenth time. "Davidson will come looking for us eventually. If he can even get into the building safely. The structure was already unstable, and now with the storm?" "Always the optimist," she snapped, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "What do you suggest we do? Play charades until rescue arrives?" James took a deliberate breath. "I suggest we conserve energy and air. This room wasn't designed for extended occupation." "Fine," Victoria huffed, causing her chest to puff out more and rub on his, inadvertently drawing James's attention to the movement. He quickly averted his eyes, focusing on a water stain on the ceiling instead. The silence resumed, heavier than before. The only sounds were their breathing and the storm outside, both seeming to grow more intense as time passed. The small room had become uncomfortably warm, the air thick and close. James had worked with Victoria for 3 years, but he'd never been confined with her like this. Never been forced to acknowledge her as a physical presence rather than just his demanding boss. Another 10 minutes passed before Victoria broke again. "This is ridiculous. I can't just stand here doing nothing." "What exactly do you propose to do in a maintenance closet?" asked James, his usual deference fraying at the edges. "I don't know. Something. Anything." She began to pace, which in the tiny room meant taking one step in each direction. The movement brought her repeatedly into James's personal space, her chest brushing against his chest on each turn. "Could you stop that?" he asked, pressing himself further against the wall. "You're making the air hotter." Victoria halted abruptly, her face inches from his. "Are you saying I'm making you hot, James?" There was a taunting edge to her voice, one she recognized from countless boardroom confrontations when she sensed weakness. "I'm saying your movement is raising the ambient temperature in an already stifling space," he replied evenly, refusing to be baited. She studied him for a moment, her blue eyes narrowed. "You know what your problem is? You're too controlled, too contained. Even trapped in an abandoned park during a storm, you maintain that perfect assistant composure. I learned from you. Or would you prefer I panic?" "I'd prefer you be human for once." She drew closer, leaving the non-existent space between them. "Does anything rattle you?" The proximity was becoming unbearable. He could smell her perfume, something expensive, mixed with the faintest hint of perspiration. It was an intoxicating combination he immediately tried to forget noticing. "I'm perfectly human," he said, his voice slightly strained. "I just don't see the benefit in making a bad situation worse by losing control." Victoria's laugh was short and sharp. "Control. That's all you think about, isn't it? Following rules, maintaining boundaries, being proper." She reached up and flicked his tie with one manicured finger. "Even your Windsor mott is perfect after minutes in this hellhole." He resisted the urge to step away. There was nowhere to go. "Someone in this company needs to maintain standards," he said, immediately regretting the implication. Victoria's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me? Are you suggesting I don't maintain standards?"
Of course not. I just meant... I know exactly what you meant. She leaned closer, her expression dangerous. You think I was impulsive, reckless, that my decisions lacked the usual careful consideration. The truth was he did think that, but he valued his job and his life too much to admit it. Miss Sharp, I've always respected your leadership style. Don't Miss Sharp me when we're trapped in a box together. And don't patronize me. 3 years you've worked for me, and you still think I don't see the judgment in your eyes when I make calls you disagree with? James felt a surge of irritation. If you want honesty, fine. Yes, coming here was reckless. Yes, entering an unstable building during a storm showed poor judgment. And yes, I did warn you about both. For a moment, Victoria looked genuinely surprised by his candor. Then her eyes flashed with that familiar, cold fire. Finally, some backbone. I was beginning to think your spine was as decorative as your pocket square.
A particularly loud crash from outside made them both jump, inadvertently bringing them even closer together. In the confined space, the sudden movement left them pressed against each other, faces mere inches apart. Neither moved. James could feel Victoria's breath on his lips, the rise and fall of her chest against his. For a suspended moment, something electric passed between them, something that had nothing to do with their professional relationship. Victoria was the first to break the silence, her voice unusually low. If you move your head even slightly, we'll be kissing. The observation hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor invitation, just a statement of fact that somehow changed everything about the atmosphere in the tiny room. Then perhaps you shouldn't talk, James replied, his voice barely audible over the storm outside. He was painfully aware of every point of contact between their bodies, of the way her eyes dropped briefly to his mouth before meeting his gaze again. Are you telling your boss to be quiet? Victoria asked, not moving away. If anything, she seemed to lean infinitesimally closer, testing boundaries she herself had established long ago. I'm suggesting that in our current position, speaking creates complications, he managed, desperately trying to maintain his professional demeanor, when all he could focus on was the fact that her lips were close enough that he could feel her form each word. Complications, she repeated, the movement brushing her lips against his for the briefest moment. James froze, his heart rate spiking. It wasn't a kiss, not really, just an accidental contact caused by their proximity, but it sent a shock through his system that was impossible to ignore. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, registering the contact as well. For a moment he thought he saw something vulnerable flash across her features, confusion, perhaps, or curiosity, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Don't you dare try anything, she warned, though she still didn't step back. Just because we're stuck in here doesn't mean workplace boundaries disappear. The accusation stung. With all due respect, Ms. Sharp, you're the one who keeps moving closer, James pointed out, his professional patience finally wearing thin. If you're concerned about boundaries, perhaps you should be the one to step back. There's nowhere to step back to, she hissed. And stop talking, your lips keep... She trailed off, her eyes fixed on his mouth. That's what I was trying to tell you. If you'd stop talking, you stop talking. Fine. They glared at each other in heated silence, neither willing to be the first to move away, both acutely aware that every breath brought them into contact. James could feel his heart hammering against his ribs and wondered if Victoria could feel it too. They were pressed so closely together. After what felt like an eternity, Victoria broke the silence again, her voice softer than he'd ever heard her. Your breath. James braced himself for another cutting remark. "It's actually quite fresh," she finished, sounding genuinely surprised. The unexpected compliment caught him off guard. "Thank you?" "Better than most men," she continued, a hint of her usual sharpness returning. "At least you're not like some with their fish breath. Small mercies, I suppose." Before James could respond to the backhanded compliment, Victoria did something that shattered every professional boundary between them. She closed the microscopic distance, her fingers threading through his hair at the nape of his neck. The gesture was possessive, commanding, utterly Victoria Sharp, and she pressed her lips deliberately against his. James felt his soul leave his body, his breath catching as he registered what was happening. For 3 years he had maintained perfect professional distance from Victoria Sharp, admiring her from afar, enduring her caustic remarks, suppressing any inappropriate thoughts. And now, in an abandoned amusement park maintenance room, she was kissing him. This wasn't tentative or exploratory. It was acclaiming, fierce, and unapologetic. Her lips moved against his with practiced skill, her tongue sweeping boldly across his lower lip before delving deeper. James's eyes went wide with shock, his pupils dilating as the full impact hit him. His hands flew up instinctively, hovering uncertainly in the air before finding purchase against the wall behind him. The kiss was nothing like he had imagined. It was fire and silk, demanding and generous all at once. Victoria kissed like she did everything else, with complete mastery and unwavering confidence. She angled her head, deepening the kiss further, one hand sliding down to grip his tie while the other remained tangled in his hair. The small sound she made against his mouth, part satisfaction, part hunger, sent electricity racing down his spine. When she finally pulled back, her breathing was slightly uneven, her lips flushed and glistening. James stared at her with wide, dazed eyes, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked utterly undone, his usual composure completely shattered. "My God, that was—" She smiled triumphantly, her eyes bright with satisfaction at his reaction. "That was me kissing you," she said matter-of-factly, though her fingers still played with his tie. He remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might either end the moment or encourage something he knew would be professional suicide. His mind raced with confusion, while his body responded with immediate, undeniable interest.
Victoria pulled back slightly, her eyes studying his face with analytical precision. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, where his heart was thundering in erratic rhythm. "Your heart is racing," she observed, her tone curious rather than mocking. Without warning, she leaned in again, reclaiming his lips with more purpose this time, as if conducting an experiment and checking the results. James's hands remained rigidly at his sides, though every instinct urged him to pull her closer. When she finally broke the kiss, he turned his face slightly away, struggling to regain his composure. "Ms. Sharp, I think you should back off." Victoria's expression held something dangerous, a mixture of amusement and predatory interest. "I don't think I will," she replied, her fingers now tracing a pattern on his chest. "You work for me, James. You're essentially my property from 9 to 5. I can do as I please." The possessive statement sent a conflicting surge of indignation and unwanted arousal through him. "That's not how employment works," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "And I'd appreciate it if you didn't confuse the situation." "What situation?" Victoria asked innocently, though her hand continued its exploration, now playing with his tie. "I'm just alleviating the boredom while we wait for rescue." James knew better than to mistake her actions for genuine interest. This was Victoria Sharp. The woman who had spent 3 years making cutting remarks about his height, his clothes, his cautious nature. She didn't see him as a man. She saw him as a convenient distraction, another thing she could control. "I'm a man, Ms. Sharp," he said firmly, catching her wrist to stop her wandering hand, "and you shouldn't get careless." Victoria looked pointedly at his hand on her wrist, then back up to his face with a raised eyebrow. "A man? I don't see a man here. I see an employee who's forgetting his place." Her casual dismissal hit with precision. James released her wrist as if burned, anger flaring bright and hot within him. "Stop acting like a bitch," he said, the words escaping before he could censor them. "This is sexual harassment and you know it." Rather than the outrage he expected, Victoria laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and delight that he had never heard from her before. "Bold words from someone who's still technically on the clock," she said, but there was no real malice in her tone, just a strange sort of appreciation. The sound of her laughter did nothing to ease the tension coiling tight within him. If anything, it made it worse. This version of Victoria, playful, unpredictable, was more dangerous than her usual icy demeanor. At least with cold Victoria, I knew where I stood. This Victoria made me forget all the reasons I should keep my distance. James shifted uncomfortably, trying to create space between them, but the confines of the room made it impossible. Worse, his body was responding to her proximity in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. He silently prayed she wouldn't notice, knowing Victoria would never let him live it down if she realized the effect she was having on him. "Look," he said, his voice strained as he fought for control. "This is an unprofessional situation that we found ourselves in. Let's not make it worse by doing things we'll both regret when we get out of here." Victoria tilted her head, studying him with the same intensity she usually reserved for quarterly reports and competitor analyses. "Who says I would regret it?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that James refused to consider. He was not going to be a momentary diversion for Victoria Sharp. He had spent years building his professional reputation. He was not going to throw that away for a moment of weakness in a maintenance closet.
"I would," he said firmly, even as part of him silently acknowledged the lie. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something crossing her features before her usual mask slipped back into place. "Your loss," she said with nonchalance, taking a tiny step back. The movement created the barest hint of distance between them, but it felt like a chasm. James took a deep breath, trying to center himself, to remember who they were outside of this bizarre bubble of time and space. "When we get out of here," he said carefully, "I think we should both agree to forget this happened." Victoria's gaze was cool and assessing. "Already forgotten," she said, but her eyes told a different story. The silence that followed was excruciating. James focused on controlling his breathing, on willing his body to calm down, on mentally reciting financial regulations, anything to distract from Victoria's presence mere inches away. She had returned to examining the door mechanism, her side features to him, the line of her beautiful jawline and elegant neck. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The air in the small room grew increasingly stifling, charged with unspoken words and unfulfilled possibilities. James had never been more aware of another person's presence, the subtle shift of Victoria's weight from one foot to the other,
the faint scent of her expensive perfume, the sound of her controlled breathing. Just when he thought the tension might suffocate them both, there was a metallic click. The door, seemingly of its own accord, swung open, revealing the dim corridor beyond. The sudden release from their confinement was so unexpected that neither of them moved for a moment, as if unsure whether to trust this apparent salvation. James was the first to break the spell. Without a word, he stepped quickly out of the maintenance room, drawing in a deep breath of the musty but comparatively fresh air of the abandoned amusement park. He needed distance, needed to reestablish the professional boundaries that had momentarily dissolved in that confined space. Behind him, he heard Victoria's heels clicking on the concrete as she followed him out. He didn't turn around, didn't trust himself to look at her just yet. "James." Victoria's voice was surprisingly tentative. He paused, but didn't turn. "Yes, Miss Sharp?" "This incident doesn't leave this building. Are we clear?" James nodded once, still facing away from her. "Crystal clear." "Good. Now let's get back to the car and salvage what's left of this disaster of a day." As they walked in silence toward the exit, James knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful professional distance he had maintained had been breached, and he wasn't sure it could ever be fully restored. Victoria strode ahead of him, her posture perfect, her demeanor once again that of the untouchable CEO. Anyone looking at her would never guess that minutes ago she had been kissing her assistant in a maintenance closet. James followed a step behind, as was his usual position. On the surface, everything was back to normal, but beneath that surface, a current now ran between them, powerful, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. The question was whether either of them would be brave enough or foolish enough to acknowledge it again.
Thanks for listening. To continue the story, tap the thumbnail on your screen. And if you're enjoying this romance, give it a like and subscribe to Spoken Romance Library audiobooks.